What's the difference between this and this? What does this third game in the series have that this third game in the series lacks? Long story short, it's iteration. Thank you for watching, bye bye. Okay, maybe that was a bit over-condensed, so let's break it down some. The Witcher 1 came about 14 years ago and was quickly gobbled up by the gaming community. Reviewers couldn't stop telling you how good the game was. What they didn't tell you was how unbearably clunky it was. The potions, the levels, the inventory, and menus that looked more intimidating than a 6'9" chick on stiletto heels, the combat, which was about as engaging as a game of Minesweeper, or the story that was so convoluted that, if you asked me to summarize it on a piece of paper, I'd draw crack, because that's what the writers seem to have been on when they wrote it. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for the devs to look at all that and go,
What the fuck? Fucking what?
And change it. Oh dang, these things, they aren't so good. Guess we should start from scratch. But they didn't. They kept all the systems, the potions, the crafting, the meditating, the preparation aspect, because they recognized that those were all key aspects of a Witcher's day-to-day, and that there was enough of a foundation to improve upon. A diamond in the rough, if you will. Except the combat, because damn. I remember being one of the only 3 people in the world who liked it back in the day, but even I had to admit, even back then, that it was fucking strange. You had this super complex Western RPG with deep systems and mechanics, and the combat was about as deep as fucking Flappy Bird. It's like ordering the crab-stuffed lobster tail for dinner and getting a Snickers bar for dessert. If I've learned anything during my 20-year career as an executioner, it's that some things actually deserve to be axed. Fast forward to whatever day The Witcher 2 gets released in, and it improved upon every single aspect, except it was still kind of Magoo. The combat was a bit unforgiving, much like your wife. The story was still an experimental clusterfuck, and all the other systems were better, but hadn't quite come together as neatly as they could have. So again, the devs had the option to say, fuck it, some of the stuff just ain't working. You know what, let's just scrap everything and make an Assassin's Creed clone. But they didn't. They couldn't. They were compelled to stay, compelled to disobey. Once again, they chose to iterate, and this time, boy, did it pay off. The Witcher 3 is where all of this, all the stubbornness and iteration came together in one gigantic game that just worked. The combat was perfected, the once cumbersome crafting, potion drinking, meditating, day-night cycling, inventorying, skill treeing mechanics were now about as polished as Geralt's knob after a visit to the whorehouse, and the story finally made sense. And all of this would not have been possible without iteration. The Witcher 3 would not exist without iteration. Now let's talk about Diablo, because the Diablo franchise both followed and did the exact opposite of what The Witcher did. Diablo 1 pretty much set the standard for isometric hack-and-slash roguelike inspired dungeon crawlers and defined the ARPG genre. And every good thing that Diablo 1 has done, Diablo 2 did better. This is another great example of iteration. Take what worked, like the loot, stats, story, combat, randomized dungeons, and make them better, and take what didn't work, like character mobility and a neutral skill pool, and design better systems for them. The result is a sequel that defined a generation, set and still holds the standard for ARPGs, got numerous awards, and is still being played by many people today. But barely anyone plays D3 nowadays, and less people care to remember it. Even those that like the style can't wait for D4 or something, anything to come out so they can stop playing D3. Why? Well, because while The Witcher and the reboots' predecessors both put one brick on top of the other, steadily building upon the foundations which they had, Diablo 3 didn't. Hence why I tend to call Diablo 3 the Diablo reboot, because that's essentially what it is. A soft reboot with different values at heart. D3 said, nah fam, I can do a better job from scratch. All the years worth of experience and of bricks carefully laid on top of one another were discarded. Diablo 3 did not iterate, and it shows. Essentially, Diablo 2 iterated on Diablo 1, but then the reboot came along, took all that iteration, and threw it out the window, stripping away virtually everything that made Diablo Diablo in the process, and replaced it with shoulder pads big enough to decapitate you at the first sign of shoulder flexion. I always found the WoWcrafty style of D3 to be a bit like those lewd 3D animated girls, the ones with tits so disproportionately huge that top-heavy ceases to be an adequate term to describe it, to the point where it becomes grotesque. Don't get me wrong, I like me some shapely boobs. Nature made sure I would, so that I would pick females with enough real estate there in order to feed feed any potential offspring, but this is just misshapen. If I saw a woman that sported a pair of these in real life, my first reaction would be to run up to her and grab them, not because I want to fondle them, but because I'm scared she'll tip over from the weight, like a woman desperately trying to carry her oversized shopping bags to her car without face planting. But the quasi-realistic art style and the more methodical gameplay seems to be coming back in style, what with the Diablo 2 remaster now being a thing, as Blizzard makes an effort to at least pretend to understand the value of such things. Anyway, Mass Effect is another interesting case study because it offers examples of both iteration and non-iteration. If we're talking about the trilogy, then the most perceivable shift in direction comes not between the second and third games like with Diablo, but between the first game and its sequels, because the first one is a full-blown RPG with more elaborate skill systems and gear, whereas the second and third ones are more third-person shooters with RPG elements. The difference is nowhere near as drastic as with the reboot. All three Mass Effect games have the same spirit, but this just goes to show that as soon as you scrap something, however small, instead of iterating upon it, people will notice. Like how you notice when your spouse changes her sweet potato pie recipe and expects you to like it just as much as before, even though it's a far cry compared to the first version. Or when they change the recipe for your favorite fizzy drink and use cheaper ingredients and you instantly notice the difference. Is that just me? I always thought that wasn't just me. Maybe it's just me. Whenever Mass Effect stripped some feature or mechanic from itself, people felt kinda disappointed, be it instantly or eventually. Even the Mako ended up being more missed than not, warts and all. Thankfully though, as I said before, the series mostly iterates and builds upon the important bits. But if you want to see what pretending to iterate without actually iterating looks like, look no further than the adopted child of the Mass Effect family. Andromeda. Let's be fair and point out some stellar examples of actual iteration first, like the gunplay. Everything about the combat in this game feels amazing. On a macro level, it has a few flaws, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is more dopamine-inducing than a sorry melding. Almost everything that worked about Mass Effect 3's combat was dialed to 11. Too many chest-high walls, dynamic cover system, limited mobility, jetpacks, rigid skill system, favorites. The Nomad is a curious example because you can make the case that they didn't necessarily iterate on the concept of the Mako, they just hired the Need for Speed team to make a driving minigame. But the less cynical part of me still sees this as iteration because the main role of the Mako was, arguably, exploration. This sounds counterintuitive, but shooting a big gun over and over again while satisfying isn't as engaging as exploring an uncharted world. Andromeda realized that, so it did away with the big gun and made the Nomad purely an exploration vehicle, which is akin to realizing that the extra caviar on the side of that crab-stuffed lobster tail was a tad excessive. So what's the thing that they didn't iterate on when maybe, with the benefit of hindsight, they should have? 2 words. Paragon Renegade. The Paragon Renegade system, which will get really old the more I say it, so let's portmanteau it to Parengagade. The Parengagade was derided by many, myself included, on account of it being a binary system that didn't accommodate for spontaneous player expression, i.e. actual role-playing. No, you just picked a path and mostly stuck to it. Might as well just ask you Paragon or Renegade at the start of the game and save you the trouble of a non-choice. You are 67% Renegade, 0% Paragon, and you need 70% in either one in order to defuse the imminent catfight in the mess hall 5 minutes from now. Are you sure you want to pick the Renegade option in this conversation? That's like asking, are you sure you want ketchup on your hot dog, or would you consider maple syrup instead? Non-choice issue aside, I really have to thank Andromeda because it helped me to realize just how much the Parengagade system deserved iteration instead of the axe. Okay, I did say some people deserve to be axed, but not all of them. Andromeda takes the Parengagade body and neglects to put any kind of engine or chassis underneath. The tone wheel, or whatever it's called, is nothing more than an empty shell with an interior so hollow you'll hear your own echo talking next to it. Your choices matter. Wasn't that the approximate tagline of the original trilogy? Well, the tone wheel doesn't matter. Most role-playing games, most BioWare games in particular, respect a certain 70-30 ratio. 70% of your dialogue options are fluff, with 30% being actual meaningful decisions of consequence, more or less disguised as fluff. The 70% is supposed to represent that D&D aspect of role-playing, the one that's just for fun and to facilitate player expression, while the 30% is meant to keep you on your toes and immerse you into a world that's supposedly alive enough to be affected by your decisions. But where the Mass Effect Parengagade differs isn't how it makes even that 70% matter, at least a little bit. It might not matter whether you're polite or rude in this particular conversation, it plays out the same regardless, but it does matter towards building your Paragon score so you cannot romance Samara. Okay, bad example. But it does matter towards building your Renegade score enough to shut down that scumbag Elias Kellum with one line and instantly get what you want from him. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed you to assert your views on a macro and micro level. Sometimes you might feel a particular situation calls for a Paragon approach despite playing most of the game as a hardcore renegade, or vice versa, and you can do that. The system is flexible enough to allow for that. This is a system that I personally would have tried to improve by introducing yet more paths to the mix, perhaps even some hidden ones, like a neutral path, where you mostly pick neutral options, or a chaotic path, which unlocks hidden dialogue options based on how inconsistent you are with your choices, like flipping from Paragon to Renegade to Neutral to Paragon again to Child Molester, and right back to Jesus. Think of this as the Jack Sparrow Shepherd, or the Joker Shepherd. No, not that one. That one. The Clown Prince of Shepherd. But back to Andromeda, because Andromeda doesn't do Parengagate, it doesn't even do 70-30. It goes the full 100. 100% fluff, 0% consequence. It doesn't matter if you maintain a professional attitude or if you constantly crack jokes. It doesn't matter if you're stoic or dramatic. It's even impossible to maintain a consistent tone because you rarely get the 4 options. Doesn't matter if you're cold with your crew members, they don't shut off from you. Doesn't matter if you're emotional, they don't connect with you more. It's all in your head. And if all of it is in your head and none of it is in the game's head, then you might as well just shut the game down and imagine all the scenes all on your own. At least there they can have some actual consequences. The Parengagate worked partly because it was a system of extremes, of opposing viewpoints, red versus blue, ruthless pragmatism versus selfless compassion, end justifies the means versus means impact the end. By the way, red, blue, pragmatist, people person, Republican, Democrat. Come on, I can't be the only one. But yeah, Andromeda pretends to iterate on the Parengagate while surreptitiously regressing. It is now a system without a purpose. The game could give you a skip choice option every time, and you could click that every time in every conversation without changing the story one bit. This is mass ineffect. This is mass defect. How about mass deflect questions about the ending? This is crass effect, or lax effect, spaz effect, mass inept, which makes me mass upset. This is mass exodus to Andromeda to hide the fact that we potentially turned everyone back home into a green-tinted Terminator. You know, when I first heard the term Mass Effect, I thought it was a game about the Catholic Church. It did end up being about a shepherd caring for his flock, so I wasn't too far off.